Good morning. I'm calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Committee of the Whole. I'm going to ask folks to wind down their conversations as we begin this meeting, please. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of the Committee of the Whole, and I'm joined today by Council members Gordon, Kano, Reich, Bender, Council President Johnson, Council member Andrew Johnson, Yang, Quincy, Warsami, Goodman, Fry, and Palmisano. We are a full quorum today of all 13 council members. And we have 3 items on our agenda for today. The first is a public hearing and consideration of a charter amendment regarding vote thresholds for issuance of municipal bonds. Because I think most people here are for item number 2. I'll just say I think this will be a fairly brief item, is my anticipation. Item number 2 is consideration of the 20-year neighborhood park plan ordinance. And this also is a public hearing that has been continued from our last cycle until today. So our public hearing is still open. And then item number 3, which is a consent item, is our final action to designate the Community Action Partnership of Suburban Hennepin as our City of Minneapolis Community Action Agency. So we will turn now to item number 1, which is the proposed charter amendment. And I'm going to ask Mr. Bert Osborne to give us an overview of this item. Then we will open the public hearing, and then we will have the council discuss and vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the City Council. Before you today is a public hearing, as the Chair pointed out, on a proposed amendment to the City Charter regarding lowering the voting thresholds required to sell bonds and transfer money or acquire realty by the Board of Estimate and Taxation. When the Board of Estimate and Taxation came into being, it had 7 members, and to do those things required an affirmative vote of 5 of the 7 members. With the merger some years ago now, one of the Board of Estimate and Taxation seats was held by a library board member. With the merger of the Minneapolis libraries and the county libraries, that board seat disappeared. But the charter nevertheless still required an affirmative vote of 5 members. So instead of 5 of 7, it was 5 out of 6, which is a much higher burden. The proposed amendment to the charter would be to take out reference in the charter to a specific number of affirmative votes and just change that to an affirmative vote of at least 2/3 of all the members of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So as membership decreases or increases, the threshold would remain the same.
All right. Any questions? And I apologize, I'm just getting on my speaker management right now. Any questions for Mr. Osborne? I'm not seeing any. So I will go ahead then and open the public hearing and ask if there is anyone here who would like to speak on this proposed amendment to the city charter. And Ms. Becker, please come forward.
I'm Carol Becker. You guys all know me from the Board of Estimate. And actually, I'm in support of this. It's awkward. We have 6 members, and having to have 5 is a really high threshold. And so I think this makes a lot of sense. And should the number change on the board, then this requirement would change proportionally with it, and that makes a lot of sense too. So,
thank you for letting us know your thoughts. I might just ask if you wouldn't mind signing in, just so we make sure we've got a good record of you speaking on this issue today. And anyone else? Mr.
Sheldon Maines. I wasn't going to speak on this, but as the last library board member of the Board of Estimate and Taxation,
right. Okay.
I think this makes total sense, and I'm glad it's happening.
Okay. And Mr. Maines, I'm going to invite you as well to go and sign up so we have a record that you spoke on this item today. Anyone else who would like to speak on this proposed charter amendment? I'm not seeing anyone, so I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. And let me just double check my action here. I will move then to amend the city charter as recommended by the Charter Commission to revise, clarify, and ensure consistency in vote thresholds required by the Board of Estimate and Taxation related to the issuance of bonds as set forth in sections 5.5, 9.3, subdivision A68, and 9.4, subdivision A1B, and 9.6D. All right. And I've moved that. Not seeing any discussion. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. Thank you very much. And I should have noted that because this is a charter amendment, it did require a 13-0 vote, and which did happen. All right, we are moving on now to item number 2 on the agenda, and this is consideration of what's titled on here, the 20-year Neighborhood Park Plan Ordinance. But the title perhaps might have been updated because we actually have in front of us now an action that was forwarded through our Ways and Means Committee, which is a 20-year plan for funding parks and streets. And I just wanted to make a couple comments, and then we are going to have a presentation by our city attorney of proposed ordinance language. We will have an overview of the financial implications. That is a shorter version of what was presented in our Ways and Means meeting, and then we will continue with the public hearing. I'm not sure really if I have to reopen it, but anyway, then we will take public testimony, just so that you have a full understanding before folks want to come to testify of what really is in front of us, what we are going to consider today. As we get going, I just wanted to say that I believe we've heard from a number of council members, the mayor, park commissioners. I think a lot of agreement on concepts that are coming forward today. And I mean, honestly, this is a really momentous thing to have this type of agreement on goals between the park board and the city of Minneapolis that are critical goals to the future of our city. And I don't want this moment to kind of go without saying that. And I would like to especially thank Council President Johnson, Councilmember Goodman, who took the initiative to have one-on-one conversations with the park board to get us going. I want to thank Mayor Hodges and Councilmember Quincy for introducing some very important concepts around how are we thinking of other critical priorities that we should be thinking of at the same time, our streets, and how are we ensuring that we as a council together are thinking through financial implications. And there are many other council members who have weighed in, talked about issues. There's been a lot of discussion of race equity concepts. I want to thank Councilmember Cano for really putting our attention on this. Councilmember Warsami has also talked about this, many others. So I think we have had a lot of agreement. As often happens when you are dealing with something that needs to be articulated then into writing, we have some work that happens back and forth, and because we're public bodies, some of that work happens here in the public meeting about how do we get to a language that is the right language to fit this proposal. And essentially that's what's happening right now. So we have a timeline that frankly is an aggressive timeline that has been proposed by the park board, and that's fine. But that is why we end up having some back and forth sometimes on language. And I think we're going to see some proposals that hopefully get us closer on these language issues. But as we get to hopefully what is a final proposal on language, I just wanted to again highlight that this has been a momentous coming together around goals, and now we try to see how do we articulate those goals into the right kind of language that we feel is responsible, reflects our intention, and that we can agree upon. So with that, I'm going to ask Susan Siegel if she would come forward and help us understand what is actually in front of us. There are written materials, if you have not had a chance to get them, that are up by the clerk. If folks would like some written copies of what Ms. Siegel is going to talk about. Ms. Siegel.
Right. Madam Chair, thank you very much. I'm going to run through this combined ordinance. There was an initial ordinance introduction by the Council President, Barbara Johnson, and Council Member Lisa Goodman, and that just dealt with the neighborhood parks part of this. The biggest change between that and what is referred to in the materials now as the substitute ordinance is the addition of a street infrastructure funding plan. I want to thank Nikki Newman from my office for her excellent quick drafting skills. She has gone above and beyond. And then over the last 24 plus hours, I've been in discussions back and forth with legal counsel for the park board. We have some additional tweaks in language where it is my understanding that that there is an agreement with this tweaked language, so that there are no substantive changes at all between this combined plan with respect to the neighborhood parks funding plan and what was originally proposed. It's the same deal vis-a-vis the neighborhood parks. So the initial proposal, and I'm going to do this in this way, so I'll deal with neighborhood parks funding first. It called for a joint park board city 20-year financial plan for improvements, maintenance, rehabilitation, capital projects for neighborhood parks. And neighborhood parks are to be distinguished from the larger regional park systems, such as the chain of lakes and the parks around the river. The park board and the city will pass concurrent ordinances as the plan dealing with the neighborhood park funding provisions, and that this plan will be in lieu of any ballot measures. There is currently pending in front of the Charter Commission a proposal from a request from the park board for a charter amendment to provide for additional funding. And so this plan would be in lieu of such a measure. There's an agreement for startup money to go to the park board of $1.5 million in January, the beginning of January of 2017, and an agreement to recommend to the Board of Estimate and Taxation a $3 million increase in the park board's annual base levy starting in 2017. And the assumption is that that base would be on an ongoing, continuing increase. Then in addition to that, to allow for capital improvements and rehabilitation of park facilities, there would be guaranteed minimum annual funding of $10.5 million per year. Currently, the city budgets for $2.5 million through its existing capital improvement bonding process. An additional $8 million would be added to this per year. It can be used only for the neighborhood park system for capital and rehabilitation projects. And there will be a review for inflation adjustments every 5 years. The city, there's a steam valve, if you will, built into the ordinance where in the event of an exigent economic circumstance, such as the Great Recession we recently weathered, or unanticipated critical needs, that the city could adjust that on a year-by-year basis. There's an agreement in the ordinance that the park board will continue to receive 11.79% of the city's annual local government aid. This has been the city's practice. This will now be memorialized in ordinance. And then there's a provision that if the city significantly reduces or suspends the $10.5 million per year for at least 3 consecutive years, then the ordinances terminate. And the park board can seek other ways to obtain needed funding. The new provisions really provide for street infrastructure improvements and maintenance. So the new ordinance will provide a 20-year plan for both neighborhood park needs and street maintenance and capital needs. It establishes an anticipated funding plan for the 20 years of what sources will be used. And thankfully, I have the Chief Financial Officer here, Mark Ruff, who will be talking through that. But the actual proposal will be linked to this ordinance so that sources are identified. Obviously, that can be varied depending on future circumstances, and there are provisions for that in the ordinance. The street infrastructure plan, as I said, provides for a 20-year plan for road maintenance and street capital projects. There's a proposal for an $800,000 increase in the base budget for public works for street maintenance beginning with the 2017 budget. And then in addition to that, there would be a guaranteed minimum annual funding of $21.2 million per year over the current city general fund expenditures for street capital projects. Then for both the park board and the streets projects, there are reporting provisions which are new. The park board is being asked to report with an initial report to the city council on a 5-year project plan focusing on racial and economic criteria that they will use in establishing their plan and how they're going to spend this funding, and including an analysis of the expected impact on overall operating costs. And then after that, they will provide annual reports updating the city council on how they're doing on those criteria, and then what happened the year before and what will happen the year after.
So, Ms. Siegel,
Yeah.
just as you're turning the page here, I'm going to, I probably should have done this before you began, but my understanding is that what you are running through for us is a version of the substitute ordinance that has been passed out in paper form, because it reflects some discussions that you have had with the Park Board's council fairly recently. Am I understanding that right? Just because there are people who are looking at the online, I'm getting email communication about people who are looking at the online version and of the ordinance, and I think there is a newer version, and I may be confused myself. I think we want to just understand, what are we looking at? And maybe you can help us with that. And Council President, I think you would be the one, also you're the chief author, who could help us with that.
Madam Chair, thanks for the question. I think this PowerPoint is general enough that it applies to the substitute ordinance that is linked online. But as I mentioned,
people are really concerned to make sure they've got the right language.
Yes.
Who are the council members? Just because we're going to be voting today, probably, and we want to know we're looking at the right product.
The city clerk, do you want to say what it's linked, what the title is in the online link?
So, Madam Chair, the books that we had prepared for you are the most recent copy, and under the first tab is a clean version of the substitute ordinance that incorporates, as the city attorney was indicating, the original provisions of the Johnson-Goodman Parks funding proposal, as well as the street infrastructure funding proposals discussed at Ways and Means on Monday. Behind the second tab in the book is a redlined version that shows the drafting changes. What Ms. Siegel is going through is a high-level summary of that. To be clear, there are some additional potential changes or amendments that may be coming forward that Ms. Siegel may have been addressing at a high level, but are not necessarily drafted in this document. So it would be best for the council to refer to the materials in the packet printed in front of you. The online version, of course, will be updated after this meeting to reflect what actually is done by the council, including any additional amendments that might be brought forward today. And I won't speak for the city attorney, but I think she was getting ready to say it's a general review of what we have done so far. There are, while I'm speaking, additional copies of this book back here on the table, just a few. We've tried to tell people that as well, so they can follow along as well.
And I want to apologize to my colleagues. I should have asked the clerk to probably help us go through the materials at the beginning, and also for the public to understand what we're discussing. So I just want to give my apologies. I should have done that. Council President.
And Madam Chair, after we're through with Ms. Siegel's presentation and Mr. Ruff's presentation, then it's my intention to bring forward what Mr. Carl has at this point, which is going to be an amendment to the substitute ordinance that is in front of us. And that would be just with some very current and minor changes, I would say, in the action, and I would go through them at that time. Not substantive changes, but changes that we have discussed with the Park Board to get their acquiescence, their approval going forward. So it is fairly minor, but there are a few things that came up in our discussions, as you said, back and forth. This is not a simple ordinance. And so it's my intention then after we're through with the presentations, I'll bring the amendments forward.
Okay. Let me just check, see if there are any questions. Okay, Councilmember Gordon.
So I wanted to just get clarity that the redlined version and the clean version at the front of the book are actually the same ordinance. It's just been cleaned up. So if we want to see the changes, we go to the redlined, and if we don't want to, if we just want to see it cleaned up, we go to the first one.
Madam Chair, to be very clear, under the first tab is the clean version as it would appear if adopted with no further amendment. The second tab provides the red line version, which shows the attorneys drafting changes, amending the original ordinance to incorporate the funding for the street infrastructure plan.
So I did want to ask one question about it, if I may. And this has to do with the definition of neighborhood park system, which is one of the definitions in the ordinance. And it says a neighborhood park system means those parks that, one, are owned or leased and operated and maintained by the MPRB. 2 are generally less than 2 blocks in size, but may be larger. And 3 are neither designated as part of the Metropolitan Council system of regional parks and trails, nor part of any of the MPRB's golf courses. And I just wanted to be clear that that section and that definition, the way it's written, would not include the commons. And is that true?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, it would not include the commons.
But and the only way it could include the commons is if the commons became operated and maintained by the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board, because it isn't right now.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, I suppose that yes, it could, but we have a 30-year memorandum of agreement with the Park Board where the city is responsible for operating and maintaining the commons. So there would have to be negotiation with the Park Board over that. So it's not currently. It's not in this definition.
And I think it's important that that's clear because there was some confusion about that, or I was curious about that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
We have another question or comment from Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think anybody would accuse me of being unsupportive of the commons, yet this is a funding plan for neighborhood parks and should not include the commons on this particular instance. So just wanted to say that for the record.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that, if there needs to be even a greater clarification in this ordinance with language specifically saying that this piece of land is not intended to be part of what's covered in the ordinance, I think there's a lot of agreement, as I'm hearing, and I'll just speak for myself, that would not be the intention of what we want to be covered. And if we need greater clarity, it seems to me that could be accomplished.
Madam Chair, that's correct. I think the current language covers it, although there is going to be a tweak to this definition to make sure we're not leaving out Brian Coyle Center and one other park.
There's another park that's called Phelps Park. I just want to speak up for Phelps.
So those two are covered. The commons is not covered.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, and so then the same reporting will apply to the Public Works Department as to the Park Board. And with that, I am done with my overview, now that everything is crystal clear.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Mark Ruff, the city's Chief Financial Officer, here to present a quick overview of the funding plan. This presentation is 99% the same as what was presented at Ways and Means, and so then the language, while important, has changed. The numbers underlying the language has been consistent over the last couple of days. The city attorney reviewed the startup funding. Just a couple of highlights of that. The street portion, we've tried to address both of these equally within the funding system that is being proposed. The program overall, without identifying specific sources, with a couple of exceptions. One of these exceptions is how these startup funds are to be paid for. The park funding, while those might be 2016 and potentially even some 2017 costs, those will be reimbursed in January of 2017. That should be coming out of an allocation from probably what would likely be the 17 budget recommendation, but those would largely be funds that hopefully are secured by revenues that were not anticipated in the 16 budget or expenses that were not incurred in the 16 budget. The street funding of the $250,000 would come out of the Street Public Works Department budget. The city attorney alluded to 2 factors that are in the ordinance that will be funding this program. That does add up to $33 million of new budget expenditures in 2017. With inflation, that's the number that times 20 is $660 million. With inflation, the number that's been quoted as $800 million. I do want some perspective in this. Number one is a question that may be raised is $800 million going to imperil the financial future of the city? The perspective is this. The city has a $1.3 billion annual budget. So if we look over 20 years, this new program is 2.5%, less than 2.5% of the city's expenditures over the next 20 years, assuming inflation stays the same, which we know it won't, but this is a reasonable estimate. So it's not to take away of the importance of this program and the words of the committee chair about how momentous this occasion is, but I also want to balance that with the fact that this is achievable and affordable within the context of the overall financial management of the city. And I would also say that I'm grateful for the leadership, both in the mayor's office and in the council, of providing actually a spreadsheet as a part of this action, which will introduce a fiscal discipline such that the commitments that are being made today have consequences. And those consequences are, if factors change in the future, which inevitably they will, and I'm not talking about major economic downturns, I'm just talking about annual changes in the budget, that those are going to be accounted for and planned for so that this 20-year program can, in fact, be sustainable. And I think that's in everybody's best interest. It also helps us in talking to the bond rating agencies, is that bond rating agencies are always clearly concerned about what decisions council and the mayor makes and what the long-term implications are. This is laid out in this plan, and I think that's a very good thing. The funding plan does have a mix of revenues. It does have the money available in 2017, but there is the ability of having some flexibility when that money is spent. So we don't expect all of the $22 million of new street money to be spent in 2017, but it's going to be allocated, it's going to be appropriated and available to them, if not in 2017, then in later years. It is mostly pay-as-you-go, meaning that funded out of cash, but there is debt in this funding plan. There's always trade-offs in decisions that are made in funding from a variety of sources. We'll walk through some of those trade-offs. And this annual reevaluation and making it part of the budget process, I think, is very important. It is, but at the same time, recognition that this additional funding is programmed long-term into the budget. When we talk about the mix of revenues, it is still primarily property tax based. Right? Out of that $1.3 billion of annual budget, the property tax levy of both existing park board and city levies, including debt service, is just under $300 million for 2016. So property taxes will be increasing to help support this program, but it'll be offset by some other non-property tax revenues, some reductions in current levies, and some cash. This is a chart that just describes how those sources interrelate. You can see that the property tax levy starts slowly and then increases fairly significantly in year 5 and 6, and we'll talk about the basis for that significant increase. Debt is issued on an annual basis, starting potentially in year 1 in 2017. We start paying for that debt in the year after. And you can see that the debt is issued. This red line is not the debt service payments, but the amount of debt that's issued on an annual basis. What are some of those other sources that are highlighted in that chart? Number one is we are counting on more sales tax. Ms. Christensen from Finance and Property Services gave an overview in Ways and Means with our current projections on sales tax. Sales tax is a volatile revenue source. It does increase and decrease depending on economic activity and visitors in the greater Minneapolis area. We are anticipating that with some new base, we're not anticipating changing any tax rates at this time, but with new base, we should be able to rely upon $1 million more than what is in current year budget, 2016, that would be dedicated toward this program. It is for the full 20 years. We do have a slight inflation assumption on that, just 1% for the purposes of this program. Certainly overall, we do expect higher than that increases in inflation on that revenue source. That is embedded in the general fund, a sales tax overall, along with the entertainment tax. And so what's the trade-off? The trade-off is we probably have less money left over on an annual basis to use for other capital items as the city has done in past years. The other non-property tax revenue is really, the rationale behind it is more tied to streets. And the idea is that we have stormwater fees currently that are paid on a monthly basis by all residents and businesses in the city. The stormwater fees are paid on the utility bills. Currently, for a homeowner, you're at, like the average monthly bill is about $12 per month. There are significant stormwater needs in the system. There are cash balances in that system. We are anticipating using those cash balances for other purposes. So the stormwater fee increase, and this is a one-time increase, then will be, again, like sales tax, slightly inflated over time. Is the rationale for that fee increase is the fact that most of the activity to improve the streets is related to street reconstruction. When we tear up a street, we also tear up the curb and gutter. We replace catch basins that move the stormwater from the street to the greater stormwater system. And the annual cost of stormwater improvements, if we relate those to the curb and gutter and catch basin, are about 10 to 12% of street costs. And so if we think we're going to spend $20 million a year, and not all of that's going to be reconstruction, but a fair amount of it's going to be reconstruction, at least probably 3/4 of it, and we take that times 10%, that's about $1.5 million that we're dedicating out of this revenue source to help offset the street costs so that it's not as put on the property tax levy. Certainly, people who pay taxes are also paying that fee. The addition of this fee is also then we capture some non-property tax revenue paying properties to help offset the cost of street reconstruction, specifically exempt properties, meaning exempt from property taxes. That's about a 4% increase. It's about $6 per year, and so 50 cents a month out of that $12 bill. There's also reductions in the levy from 2016, meaning that we have items in the budget in 2016 that we don't anticipate needing as much money for in future years. Two categories of those. One is the pension portion of the levy. There is for 2017 anticipated at least $5 million reduction in what our liability for the pensions will be. That is an uncertain future for a variety of reasons. Primarily, it's based...
Mr. Ruff, I apologize.
Sure.
I was looking at the wrong screen, and I didn't see that my colleague wanted to speak, Councilmember Reich. And I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No worries.
but you had just gone past the stormwater issue, and I didn't know if Councilmember Reich, who chairs our Transportation and Public Works Committee, had a question or comment on that. So my apologies.
Well, thank you, Madam Vice President. And yeah, just wanted to make sure that in the context of explaining things in terms of policy trade-offs, I think there is an inherent policy trade-off in terms of we would be slightly deviating from a best management practice of keeping discrete fee-based funds for that specific program. We've made a good argument that there's a tangential relationship to infrastructure that's typically road-related, but there is a sort of nuance to how we manage people who pay fees and how that money gets used. So there's a trade-off there. I think it's a sound trade-off. There's a good argument for it, but I just wanted to make sure that there is a definite policy trade-off that could be counter-argued just in the interest of transparency and best practices that we've had in the past.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Reich, I completely agree, and I am trying to get through this presentation quickly, so if I miss some important points, don't hesitate on interrupting me. The pension levies, as we talked about, are an uncertain future source of savings in the budget. We have, as a matter of great discussion among the council members and the mayor's office, come to what we would assume to be a reasonable prognostication on what we see, at least in the short term, which is we can rely on some savings in the budget over the next 5 years. That's $5 million in 17 and 18, and then is reduced to $4 million, $3 million, and $2 million in the 3 following years. And then we anticipate then after that 5-year period that the levy would have to go back up in anticipation of either increased pension liability or then could be used for other budget needs if those savings really are realized over a long period of time. So it allows the council and the mayor through her budget process some flexibility without overly committing ourselves to what would be considered to be a more unreliable revenue source. The second area is the park board levies for the ash tree replacement. That is $1.8 million currently in the budget. That program is to end in 2021, so we are not shortening that program. We are just recognizing that there will be an opportunity to replace that levy with a levy to help with the streets and the parks. A cash source helps us in the sense of, number one, we don't have to issue debt, incur interest costs, and number two is there is then some flexibility on spending the money so that we can reserve the cash. So if we don't spend it all in 2017 for these capital items, we just carry over that cash to the following year. That'll be part of that annual fiscal discipline and changes in that spreadsheet that's attached to the official documents that you're considering today. We were asked to identify if today we had to say where would those sources of cash come from. There are 4 areas. One is the convention center of $6 million. The trade-off certainly there is that's an asset that helps bring people to Minneapolis, and our sales tax is certainly tied to more traffic downtown in the greater area of Minneapolis. But at the current time, we believe that we can afford that, or again, our trade-off is that if the capital items that the convention center has planned could, like later categories, be compensated by future bond issuance. So this is a source that we feel comfortable will not, at least in the short term, impair the ability of the city to function well. The second is the self-insurance fund. This is the fund where the city pays for legal settlements, workman compensation, some building risk. That fund is higher than what the forecasters tell us is necessary for a city of our size. We do every other year have actuarial studies that are done that try to set a minimum for that fund, and we are above that minimum in cash balance right now. Certainly the trade-off is that if the forecasters are wrong, then we will have to find other sources to help with any settlements or any kind of liability in the future. Intergovernmental fund, which is primarily information technology, has about $18 million of cash. We have more capital planning for IT than we do $18 million. The question is, how fast can we spend that money? And again, in the short term, we feel like we can live without $1 million to $3 million in that fund, but certainly like Convention Center, if there are needs that future councils identify and the mayor through her budget process as a priority, we may need to then either transfer some money or issue some debt to help offset those. The last is a common bond fund. It's a program that's been around for a long time in the city. It's been very successful. There's been very little default on the loans that we make out to businesses and nonprofits out of that bond fund. Currently, there's $33 million sitting in that reserve. That reserve, like a self-insurance fund, helps us to not ever have to levy should there ever be a default. But the legal minimum requirement there is $20 million. So we believe we could reduce that somewhere in the neighborhood of $13 million, maybe a little bit more. We may need to alter our pledge toward those bonds, but we think in the long run it'll be better off for everyone in that program to have a clearer pledge and less reserves. And so those are the sources of cash.
Mr. Ruff, we do have some questions. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. You said the total in the common bond fund was 33 million, and I was curious, what's the total in our self-insurance fund? If maybe I should know this, and my colleagues all have it memorized.
Turning to our finance staff, who know much more about this, it is slightly less than $80 million in our self-insurance fund at this point in time.
And do we know how much we pay out on a typical year? Hopefully a lot less than that.
Certainly much less than that. I don't have that figure in front of me. We can certainly do the research. I'll turn over to Ms. Christensen to answer that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Council Vice President Glidden, Councilmember Gordon, the annual payouts are significantly less than the required reserve amount. However, as with any other insurance function, the city is required to reserve funds for those claims that are incurred but not reported, meaning that we need to set aside funds to account for claims that may come down the pipeline that we don't know about right now. But the actual payouts are significantly less, under the $10 million range.
Which range?
Under $10 million at the outside.
Okay.
And significantly less than that on the overall average.
And this is different than our contingency fund, or because we also have another fund, correct, in case for snow emergencies, if something goes over budget, we have, and I'm not sure if I'm calling it the right thing, but I think of it as our contingency fund, and that's a separate fund.
Council Vice President Glidden and Councilmember Gordon, the contingency fund that you're referring to is not actually a fund. It is a kind of a backstop on an annual basis in the budget process that provides for kind of a safety net in the event that we do have a year of large expenditures in several areas, snow plowing being one example of which the contingency has been used in the past. It also provides a buffer in the event that revenues that are projected for the year do not meet expectation. This is largely associated primarily with the city's general fund, which is entirely different than the city's self-insurance fund.
And if I could maybe just insert a short, kind of more layman's description, the contingency fund, as we call it, is more about unexpected events, meaning they're not budgeted events, those kinds of things, as opposed to the self-insurance fund is all about our liability. So workers' compensation, the variety of liability claims that any organization needs to be able to pay for, with the exclusion is not about our health insurance. So that's been another common question. Is it about health insurance issues? No, we have a separate way that we actually contract for coverage of health insurance issues.
And
anything more, Councilmember Gordon?
Not till the next slide.
All right. I'm not seeing anyone else in queue. Mr. Ruff.
Sure. Madam Chair, it is important to mention that this cash is a short-term funding source in the sense that we, as fast as we expect to spend it would be in the next 4 years of the program. Certainly it could go longer than that if our capital expenditures lag a little, but it is, cash is never a good source for long-term, especially operating fund needs. The advantage of cash is for capital needs is that if there was a major crisis in the next 3 or 4 years, we could reduce some of that street funding potentially and just use less cash. So those are, again, options for you to consider without being locked in completely in terms of your sources of funding. I will also say that in future years, if that contingency money is not used, you may choose to redirect through the mayor's budget process and as the council review of that, some of that contingent money to replace some of this funding as well. Debt is a function of this program. It is $239 million on the projected basis over that approximately 17 years that was in that chart. We do have a habit, which is a good habit, of keeping debt payments short, 10 years, but we will pay off all of that debt within 20 years, meaning that if we issue bonds in year 15, those will only be 5-year bonds. We do have programmed in a 3% interest rate, but currently if we were to borrow that money for 10 years, it would be in the neighborhood of 1.5%. So we have some conservative projections on that as well. So we talk about using some of this savings of pension and cash to bridge the first several years. Part of that is the fact that we do anticipate a larger levy increase in 2021. The reason that we anticipate that is we do have a TIF decertification, a tax increment financing district that has been functioning in the city for a number of years. That is the consolidated TIF district. Because it legally must come to an end in 2020, we can capture some of that revenue. Then if the mayor and the council choose to increase the levy in 2021, currently we have about $12.2 million of annual city taxes that are captured in that TIF district, along with some other taxing jurisdictions' monies. What that number is going to be in 2021, we don't know, but that's why we have the range of $12 to $13 million. We're using about half of that to increase the levy in 2021. So we'll see some charts that'll show the relative scale of that increase compared to the other increases in the levy that are within this program. That smaller amount that's being utilized still allows some flexibility for the council in the future as to where to redirect the remaining capacity. That could be taxpayer savings, that could be other programs that you choose to fund out of that opportunity.
So hang on. This is the one I knew there would be questions. This is a big item to understand. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. And I just want to make sure that I understand what this consolidated TIF district that we're talking about is. And I think currently right now we are using the funds for two main purposes. One of them, I believe, is to finish paying for the purchase of the basketball arena downtown and maybe some maintenance and upkeep to that. And then I think we're also using about half of it for neighborhood revitalization purposes, which since our last budget includes financing almost all of the neighborhood and community relations department. So is that the same consolidated TIF district that you're talking about?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, yes. And your description of the two main uses is very accurate. It is to pay off the original bonds of the acquisition of Target Center. It is not related to any of the newer improvements that have been agreed to here in the last year. And we do anticipate that all of those bonds would be paid off before the end of that TIF district, so there is not other debt service that has to be paid for related to those bonds out of future city budgets. There is approximately $6.2 million of expenditures out of that TIF district in 2016, which are the NCR programs. And this is the opportunity that I was talking about as one of the areas where if you want to continue that level of funding, you could do that as a city in the budget process in either before 2021 or in 2021. So this program out of the $12 million is utilizing about $5 to $6 million of that $12 million. So that would allow you to continue funding those the NCR programs if you choose to. It's just going to, both of these are going to require an action which will increase the levy, and the percentage of the levy will go up. And we can highlight that in the following charts. But your description is quite accurate.
So what we would be capturing for the parks and the streets is the money essentially now that's going to the Target Center, because we would no longer be obligated to pay for the Target Center with those funds. We're going to be using sales tax revenue to pay off future
new bonds, right,
or current bonds. Okay, so I appreciate that, and that will be a discussion. Also to note is even though the levy will increase dramatically, it only will do so because instead of these property taxes flowing into a special fund outside of the levy, they'll flow right into the levy. So we may increase the levy dramatically that year, but people's tax payments won't increase. It's just because we've added more into the pool. Is that it?
That is correct. We will have, you think of a TIF district as deferred growth in our tax base, and so we will realize all of that deferred growth in that 1 year, 2021, and so the taxes, while going up, will be spread on a larger base, and the impact then net to homeowners and businesses who pay property taxes should be, assuming all other factors stay the same, neutral.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not seeing other questions. Thank you.
So the chart alludes to what we were just discussing, and I'm going to explain the colors here. The blue color is what we call current service level. So this is essentially inflation on the city's existing 2016